Last time, Dr. Gallagher raised the question, since the Bible was originally written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, do we all have to learn those ancient languages in order to be able to read the Bible for ourselves? Well, perhaps we would have to, were it not for the many noble people who, through the centuries, have undertaken the task of translating from these original languages into the many languages of earth. It's estimated now that the Bible has been translated into more than 1,800 languages, all or part of it. In fact, I saw the figure recently that perhaps 98% of the people on this earth have all or part of the Bible available to them in their own languages. But in no other language has the Bible been so frequently translated as into English. The first complete English Bible was the work of John Wycliffe in 1382. He was violently opposed in his work, strangely. His only purpose was to make the Bible available to the people of England in their own common language so they could find the truth for themselves. The printing had not been invented yet, so the whole Bible was written out by hand. He did die at home, but in an expression of opposition to his work, his body was later dug up and burned and the ashes thrown into the river. The first printed Bible was the work of William Tyndale, his New Testament appearing in 1525, and these beautiful facsimiles were prepared by the Bible Society. You'll notice that he printed it in paragraphs. Very easy to read, very small. You'll notice also there are no verse divisions. They've not been invented yet. This is 1525. The verses were invented in 1551. Tyndale also faced great opposition. You wonder why, since 90% of his work was preserved in the King James Version later. He did do a few things that may have upset the authorities. For example, when he came to the books of the Old Testament, he put some very colorful notes in there. Opposite the story of the golden calf that the Israelites worshipped at the foot of Sinai, he put in the margin, "Yea, but the Pope's bull slayeth more than Aaron's calf." Finally, he was arrested, strangled, and burned to death at the stake. And it's said that as he died, he cried, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." The climate in England began to improve on the matter of translating the Bible, and so when Coverdale's version appeared, just 10 years later in 1535, which actually was just shortly after Tyndale's death, there was not the same amount of opposition. Clearly printed version, again you'll notice, no verse divisions. They haven't been invented yet. And then 2 years later, there appeared the Rogers Bible. You notice here called the Matthew's Bible. That's another name he used. Again, no verse divisions. A few years ago, I was looking in the fine collection at the University of Chicago, and I found a 1549 printing of this Rogers Bible. It was much smaller than this and very elaborately bound. And in the margin, opposite the advice in Peter's letter that it's the duty of wives to obey their husbands, there's this little note. It says, yes, indeed, it is the duty of the wife to obey her husband in all things, but if she will not learn to obey, then it is the duty of the husband to beat the fear of the Lord into her head that she may learn to obey. Then the next version to come out was the Great Bible, and you can see why it had that name, very large, beautifully printed, but again, no verse divisions. They haven't been invented yet. This was the first authorized English translation of the Bible, the Great Bible. The next one is the so-called Geneva Bible, these beautiful facsimiles that were prepared. Now we have verse divisions. They've been invented now. In fact, it's said that a man by the name of Stephanus invented these divisions. He was preparing a concordance to the New Testament, and you need verses for that. It said he was traveling from Paris up to Lyon on horseback as he invented these divisions, and some scholars have suggested that he obviously did some of his work on the horse. This again has very interesting notes in the margin, often not too kind toward Roman Catholics. Then the next major translation, and all in the same century, was the Bishop's Bible. You can judge that the bishops must have had a lot to do with it. Very clear text, beautifully printed. This is the second authorized version. Actually, all of these are revisions of Tyndale, so maybe you should call it the second authorized revised version. And then there appeared the first Roman Catholic translation into English. Part of the work was done in Douay and part in Reims, and so this is known as the Reims Douay, or sometimes the Douay version, the Old Testament here and the New Testament here. This was translated from the Latin, of course, the Latin Vulgate that Jerome had carefully prepared years before. And then the great King James Version. We don't need to use facsimiles for this. That is, the small ones. We have a real facsimile here, and I mentioned before, this looks just exactly like a first edition. A magnificently bound volume. The title page, in the year of our Lord, 1611. And you'll note the spelling of this 20-pound volume. The S's look like, that's not fave, that's save. The whole thing is spelled like ye olde sweetie shoppy, as you'll see in some towns. There are many extra items in this King James Version that are not in modern printings. For example, as we mentioned yesterday, or the last time, the Apocrypha is right in the middle. And at the front there are many additional items, the most important of which was a preface entitled The Translators to the Reader. You see, when the King James first appeared, it was opposed quite strongly by those who preferred the second authorized, the Bishop's Bible, or perhaps the Geneva Bible. And so this preface was added to appeal to the public, please to give this new version a fair chance. And so at the very beginning it reads, zeal to promote the common good, whether it be by devising anything ourselves, note the S looking like an F, or revising that which hath been labored by others, deserveth certainly much respect and esteem, but yet findeth but cold entertainment in the world. It is welcomed with suspicion instead of love, and so on. And as this preface goes on, the appeal is continued, please to give this version an opportunity, just as the distinguished committee that prepared this revision, which is what it really is, spoke very kindly of other versions. So here, many men's mouths have been open a good while and yet are not stopped, with speeches about the translation so long in hand, or rather perusals of translations made before, and ask what may be the reason, what the necessity of the employment. Hath the church been deceived, say they, all this while? Why the necessity for this new version? And then as far as other versions are concerned, to the same effect say we that we are so far off from condemning any of their labors that travailed before us in this kind, in these previous versions, either in this land or beyond sea, either in King Henry's time or King Edward's, if there were any translation or correction of a translation in his time, or Queen Elizabeth's of ever-renowned memory, that we acknowledge them to have been raised up of God for the building and furnishing of his church. And so on down. No reason then why there should not be other versions. It's always a paradox to hear someone who loves and defends the King James Version, to have that individual opposing other translations. The spirit of the committee that produced this great Bible was a very generous one toward other versions of the Bible. Incidentally, when the Pilgrims headed for the colonies, they would not allow a King James Version on the Mayflower. The captain said he didn't want this newfangled Bible on his boat. He thought it would bring him bad luck. But now, proceeding to the more modern era, and there have been versions all down through the years, hundreds and hundreds of them. Let me show them to you up on here on the shelf. In 1881, there appeared the New Testament of the English Revised Version. 1885, they completed the whole Bible. It had been so many years since there had been really an official revision of any kind that the excitement in the English-speaking world was very great. In fact, the New Testament of this English Revised Version was telegraphed across the Atlantic to Chicago, and the whole thing appeared in the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Times, all together on a Sunday.
Amazing.
Then, 20 years later, the members of this joint English-American committee that had put out the English Revised published the American preferences in the American Revised. Meanwhile, great discovery was made by scholars. Archaeologists digging in the Near East had found documents written in the Greek language of the time, and they found that the Greek of the New Testament was not like classical Greek, but was the common, they call it koine, the vernacular language of the people. And they argue that if the people of Paul's day could read his epistles in their everyday language, why should not English-speaking people have the same privilege? And so a mother went to her pastor and asked if there could not be a translation in language her children could understand. And a committee then produced what is called the 20th Century New Testament, finally finished in 1904. And then over in this country, the work of Weymouth. It went through 5 editions. And then the work of Moffat, a Scottish scholar. He did both the Old Testament and the New, and very few people have known enough about Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek to do that. And then over in America, Goodspeed. In 1923, the American translation. In American idiom, but so well done, there's no multiplication of words. You could translate his English back into the Greek. Eventually, a whole Old Testament was added to that, sometimes called the Chicago Bible. And then back here in England, the work of Phillips, his letters to young churches, eventually with the encouragement of C.S. Lewis, becoming a whole New Testament. After he'd finished the New Testament, he turned to the Old Testament. He did just 4 books, actually 3.5. Beautifully done. Then, instead of finishing the Old Testament, he went back and revised the New Testament. This is the revised copy here. He made about 2,000 changes. And the publishers would be pleased if we would use the revised one, which more accurately reflects Phillips' final thoughts about the meaning of the New Testament. If you know much about Mr. Phillips, he wrote several very readable books. One was entitled, Your God is Too Small, and another one, The Ring of Truth. He was a very warm man, and you can tell it in his translation. I remember one time a student in one of my classes elected to write a research paper on the work of Phillips. So he wrote to him across the Atlantic, a whole list of questions. Immediately there came back a reply, all handwritten by Mr. Phillips. He said, please forgive the handwriting, but my secretary is away. And Mr. Phillips answered every question the student had asked. You can tell the warmth of the man when you read his magnificent translation. Meanwhile, over in America, there appeared the Revised Standard Version, 1946 to 1952, very widely used, supported by 33 denominations. It's called Revised Standard because it really is a revision of the American Revised, which was a revision of the King James, and which was a revision of the bishops, and so on back. I wish there were time to tell the story behind every one of these. You read the preface, and you see the attitude of the people who prepared these translations, their attitude toward the Bible. Back in this country, Originally, the plan was, just as with the English and American revised back in the turn of the century, that American and British scholars would jointly produce these revisions. But World War II intervened, and America went ahead on its own and finished the Revised Standard Version. After the war, it was found that the religious climate in Britain had changed, and many of the leaders of the churches, in fact, the Church of England and the Church of Scotland and the Free Churches of England and Scotland and the Bible societies met, and they decided that what England needed in order to interest the public again in the reading of the Bible was a brand new, not revision of the previous versions, but a brand new modern speech translation. And so was produced the New English Bible, the New Testament, in 1961, and eventually the Old Testament was added. The motivation for this is expressed in this book written by A.M. Hunter of Scotland. He wrote in his book Interpreting the New Testament, 1900 to 1950, since the famous 47 did their work in 1611, that's the one on the table, nearly 3.5 centuries have passed. And in that time, our speech has so changed that the authorized version, that's the King James, for all the glories of its language, has grown more and more of a foreign tongue. The common man does not speak or properly understand the great accents of his Elizabethan ancestors. Were the Christian preacher or teacher concerned only with literary appreciation, he might rest content with the authorized version. But his task being what it is, to preach and teach the Word of God to a generation that is almost biblically illiterate, that was his word, and slowly lapsing into paganism, he demands, and rightly demands, a version of the New Testament that will clothe the word of the gospel in the vesture of our common speech and come home with living power to men who do not understand, much less appreciate, the archaic splendors of Elizabethan prose. And so appeared the New English Bible, a noble effort to interest the people of England in Bible reading. Meanwhile, other Catholic translations appeared, excellent ones. The Jerusalem Bible, with most interesting notes to read, and of course the Apocrypha there. And then the New American Bible, that's the latest authorized revision of the Rems Douay, the New American. And then Jewish translators were busy. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, produced. Eventually, 3 volumes, the new Jewish version of the Bible. Again, a very colorful translation. Perhaps the most extraordinary version of all time is this one, only 2 of the 60 volumes that will eventually make up this version. It's called the Anchor Bible, jointly produced by Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Here we have Job in the blue and Acts in the red. Also, there are the books of the Apocrypha, which are in a kind of a golden color. And then the Good News Bible that has really swept the world. It first appeared in America, very much in modern idiom, most readable and most understandable. Many different bindings. This one has illustrations in it. Printed in this country by the Bible Society and by Collins. So simple to read. A word, for example, like justify would be translated put right. And then, also back in the States, the work of Dr. Taylor, the Living Bible, also so popular. Tens of millions are in use today. His only goal, to make the Bible understandable first to his own children, and then to others all around the world. And then the New International Version, put out by the New York Bible Society, a group of evangelical conservative scholars, first the New Testament, and then the entire Bible. At home, I have many, many feet of shelves covered with Bibles. I think I have about 150 in English, but that's just a fraction. If you want to really see the translations of the Bible, go to the magnificent collection of the Bible Society, now on permanent loan at Cambridge University, or other museums and libraries around the world.
It's quite amazing, Graham, that there are so many translations and so many different versions. I think people will be very surprised to see just a small selection of them here. Now, are you telling everybody that all these translations can indeed be trusted?
But trusted for what? I mean, what do people really want of a translation of the Bible?
Well, I suppose most people are probably not even aware that there are many versions and they just go and ask for a Bible. But speaking personally, I like to have one that is easy to read and that is accurate, something that I can use readily. But tell me, do you think that some are better than others, or perhaps do you have a special preference of one that you could say that was the best?
Well, sometimes when I have visitors at home and they see just the little collection I have, about 150 different ones in English, they'll ask me which one is best. There's no way to answer that. I like all of them. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when I'm studying, I'll have many, many of them spread out on the floor. If someone wants to know which one he might enjoy the best, I would suggest going to a library, going to a bookshop, and pulling them off the shelf and reading them, and see which one you would enjoy the most, for they're all very good.
And I'm sure there's some versions that you're not very keen on. Maybe there's one you could mention just to us that you know of.
Well, there are some extraordinary ones that label themselves as a little dubious, perhaps. There's the New Testament translated from the metaphysical viewpoint, and another one from numerology. But the most extraordinary one, I see they're over on the shelf. Could you get me the third one there on the bottom? This is the most extraordinary Bible that I have. This is the New Testament revised by the spirits. It's a New Testament used by the spiritualists. It doesn't bear too much resemblance to the New Testament that we know, but there it is, put out in 1861.
So that's one that you definitely don't recommend?
Not under ordinary circumstances,
okay.
No.
Now tell us, what about Roman Catholic Bibles? You did mention some of the versions there. What do you feel about the translations there?
Well, you know, stories sometimes circulate about Roman Catholic Bibles not being good. I think they're superb. Sometimes people wonder, are the Ten Commandments translated the same? Precisely the same, indeed. I think I have every Roman Catholic English translation in my collection and appreciate them very much indeed.
Now, tell me about translations. Some are more interpretative than others. Some are more literal. And then, of course, you have the paraphrases as well.
Well, all Bibles interpret and all Bibles paraphrase. There's no way you can avoid paraphrasing. Perhaps the best-known paraphrase is the Living Bible. But in his preface, Dr. Taylor so carefully warns his reader, this is a paraphrase, and I suggest you have other more literal translations to compare with it, recognizing that the Living Bible has served people very well and has won much interest in Bible study. The most remarkable paraphrase, perhaps, is this little paperback entitled, God is for Real Man. This is the work of Chaplain Carl Burke, who was working for the youths that roamed the streets of New York. A young man came up to him one day on the sidewalk and said to Chaplain Burke, as he mentions in this little paperback, "What is God like?" And Chaplain Burke said, "Why, he's like a father." And the boy said, "Well, if he's like my father, I sure would hate him." And Chaplain Burke tried other members of the family, and the boy didn't like any of them. So he worked with these youths to try to make the picture of God in the Bible understandable to them. He had to help him rewrite the stories. The boy that helped him do the 23rd Psalm had only one person he could trust, and that was his probation officer. And so when the two of them rewrote the 23rd Psalm, it began, "The Lord is like my probation officer. He will help me." It's a very touching thing to read in the language of that young man on the streets of New York.
Now tell me, some people worry about the translator's own viewpoint coming through, about their own particular theological bias. What would you say about that?
Many of the versions have been accused of showing the religious prejudice
Right.
of the translator. I made a special study of that. I've gone through every one of them looking for this kind of thing. And it's so rare as to be conspicuous. I remember one time a gentleman, a dentist, came to my home, and he had a whole list of questions he had about the Revised Standard Version, all the evidences of theological prejudice. Hours later, the floor of my study was covered with Bibles and reference books, and he checked off the last item on his list. Well, he said, I'm going to have to go home to my church where this was being discussed and tell him I was wrong on every one of these. No, these versions can be trusted. They've been translated by very honest men. Besides, and women too, by the way, a number of women have translated the Bible. All versions come ultimately from the same Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. That's where the great safety lies, and the scholars are always watching each other. Of course, a much more important question than just can the translations be trusted is the one we'll look at next time. Can the meaning be understood?